No one in Cheyenne paid much attention when a quiet cowboy began tearing up his cabin floor as winter closed in. People laughed, some warned him, most were certain he'd made a terrible mistake. Then came the coldest night the town had seen in years. Fires went out, chimneys failed, fear filled the darkness, and suddenly the only place that stayed warm was the one everyone had mocked. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below, and if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe and share this story with someone who needs a little hope today. Cheyenne, Wyoming territory, lay under a late October sky the color of old tin, dull, low, and unwilling to promise anything kind. The wind had been at the town for days, worrying the boardwalks and rattling loose shutters as if it meant to pry the place apart plank by plank. Dust still rose in thin, spiteful ribbons from the streets, even after the first skim of frost had whitened the edges of puddles. At sunrise, the air carried that sharp, clean bite that told a man winter was no longer a rumor. It was packing its bags and had already crossed the last ridge. Cheyenne was not a city in the eastern sense. No marble, no elegance, no patience. It was a frontier capital that wore its money like a belt buckle, loud when polished, plain when dulled, always meant to be seen. The Union Pacific had made it, and the cattle had kept it. Brick storefronts stood shoulder to shoulder along the busier stretches, general stores, livery stables, a harness shop with leather hanging like dark. Tongues in the window, two banks that looked overbuilt for a town, still half convinced it might blow away one hard season. Beyond that, the wooden buildings thinned into shacks and cabins, and the kind of lean-to arrangements a man could call temporary, while secretly hoping they might become permanent if the world allowed it. Out near Crow Creek, where the land began to open and the fences grew scarce, the wind had more room to speak its mind. That was where Silas Boone lived. He was 33, with the kind of height that made doorframes seem poorly planned, and a build earned by years of riding hard and sleeping light. His hair was dark brown, kept short because long hair was trouble in wind and work, and the sun had left his face weathered in a way that made him look older until he smiled. Then the youth in him showed through, reluctant but real. His jaw was square and blunt, shadowed most days by stubble that never quite became a beard, not because he couldn't grow one, but because he disliked how it caught dust and smelled of smoke after long rides. His eyes were a clear gray blue, the color of creek water when the sky is cold. And they had the habit of watching longer than was comfortable, not out of arrogance, but out of a mind that kept measuring the world the way a carpenter measures a board, quietly, carefully, and without announcing the numbers. People in town called him a cowboy, and that was mostly right. He worked cattle when there was work to be had, rode for pay when someone needed a steady hand, and took the kind of jobs that made other men complain about back pain and bad luck. Silas complained about neither. He had a reputation for being calm, almost stubbornly so, as if his temper had been spent somewhere long ago and he didn't care to earn a new one. There had been an event behind that steadiness. Most men guessed as much. A few claimed he'd lost a brother to a winter storm on the Laramie Plains. Others said it was a woman who'd gone east and never wrote back. Silas never corrected anyone, and that silence did more to feed stories than any truth could have. His cabin sat a little apart, a one-room structure of squared logs chinked with clay, with a low roof and a small porch that faced southeast, turned away from the worst of the north wind. The place was modest, but not careless. The door hung straight, the steps didn't wobble. The woodpile was stacked in clean courses. A man who cared about details lived there, even if he didn't care about being seen. And yet, in the last week of October, he started doing something that made the careful look foolish, at least to the passing eye. He hauled stone. Not the light stuff men used to dress a hearth or line a small chimney. Silas brought in heavy creek rock, flat-faced and stubborn, the kind that took effort to pry out of mud even with a bar and a curse. He dragged them on a sled made from two worn planks, the runners greased with tallow, his horse leaning into the traces with a resigned patience. The horse was a dun gelding named Mercy, long-faced, steady, and old enough to understand that a man's strange decisions were not the horse's concern, so long as the oats came at dusk. Mercy's coat had gone pale with age, and his knees were thickened from hard country, but he still pulled like he meant to prove something. Silas laid those stones inside the cabin, not in the corner where any sensible stove would sit, but off to one side, as if he were building a second foundation over the first. He set them in a broad rectangle, leveled with care, tapping each rock into place with the butt of his hammer, adjusting with shims of shale until the surface sat true. Then he began laying brick on top, red fired brick that he could not have made himself. Brick meant money, and money meant choices, and in Cheyenne that fall most men chose wool, beans, and bullets long before they chose brick. The first person to slow down and stare was Hank Whitmore, and Hank was the sort of man who considered himself appointed as the town's living opinion. He ran the Prairie Star Saloon, a thick-walled building with swinging doors and a reputation for loud laughter that turned sour after midnight. Hank was 42, broad in the chest and belly, his face red from wind and whiskey, his mustache a thick blonde brush that drooped over his upper lip and caught foam when he drank. He dressed like he wanted to look prosperous, vest buttoned tight, boots polished when he remembered, a watch chain that flashed when the lamplight hit it. Hank was generous when he was winning and mean when he was not, and he talked with the confidence of a man who had never been forced to doubt himself in private. He reined his horse and stared at Silas through the open cabin doorway. "Boone," he called, dragging the name out as if it were a piece of jerky stuck between teeth. "You building a church in there or a tomb?" Silas didn't turn right away. He was kneeling in the dirt floor with a trowel, smoothing clay mortar along a course of brick. The work had him focused, his shoulders still, his hand steady. When he finally looked up, his expression was neutral in a way that made Hank feel laughed at without any laughter being shown. "Neither," Silas said. Hank leaned in his saddle, squinting. "That there chimney's going to be where? I don't see you cutting a hole above the fire." Silas set down the trowel and wiped his hands on his pants. "Chimney's going on the far side." Hank blinked once, slow, as if he'd misheard. "The far side," he repeated, tasting the words like something spoiled. "You mean 15 feet from where you're putting heat?" Silas nodded. Hank let out a short bark of amusement that carried into the wind. "Heat don't travel sideways, Boone. It goes up. That's a rule same as the sun rises. You trying to teach the Lord a new direction?" Silas's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, more the ghost of one. "Not teaching anybody," he said. "Just building." Hank shook his head as if disappointed, though his eyes were bright with the pleasure of having witnessed a spectacle. "Well," he said, "I'll be sure to tell the boys you're laying out a path for smoke to get lost before it kills you. Might make a fine story at the Star tonight." Silas picked up his trowel again. "Tell whoever you like." Hank's horse turned away, hooves thudding dull on frozen ground, and Hank rode back toward town with his amusement tucked under his mustache like a secret he couldn't wait to spend. By the next day, it wasn't a secret. Wagons rolling toward the rail yard slowed near Crow Creek. Riders took the long way home just to pass Silas's cabin and crane their necks. They watched him bring in more brick, watched him stack them with a precision that looked almost like a kind of devotion. A man named Gideon Rusk stopped by, one of the range foremen from south of town, 38, with a sharp nose and a goatee trimmed to points, the kind of facial hair that made him look like he was always about to offer advice. Gideon had a reputation for being practical to the point of cruelty. He'd once fired a hand for losing a glove, arguing a man careless with gloves would be careless with cattle. Gideon leaned on Silas's porch rail and spoke as though he were doing Silas a favor by sharing common sense. "Boone," he said, eyes flicking over the brickwork, "you're putting weight on dirt. That's going to settle. Crack, you'll ruin it before the first real cold." Silas answered without hostility. "It's on stone." "Stone on dirt," Gideon corrected, confident. "Dirt always wins." Silas glanced toward the creek where the water ran thin and dark beneath rims of ice. "Maybe," he said, "but stone takes its time losing." Gideon snorted, not understanding or not caring. "If you want to be warm, you build a proper hearth and you stack more wood. That's how it's done. Anything else is pride." Silas's gaze returned to the brick. "I don't have pride to spare," he said simply. That answer, quiet as it was, should have ended the conversation. Instead, it made Gideon frown, as if he'd been denied the satisfaction of calling Silas foolish outright. Gideon rode off with his certainty intact, but the words stuck in the air longer than his hoofbeats. The third visitor arrived that afternoon, and unlike Hank or Gideon, she did not come to mock. Her name was Sarah Larkin. She was around 29, perhaps 30, with a slender frame made wiry by work rather than weakness. Her hair was a deep auburn, usually pinned tight beneath a plain bonnet, but the wind had teased a few strands loose so they lifted like copper thread against her cheek. Her skin was fair with freckles scattered across her nose and the tops of her cheeks, marks left by years under open sky. Her eyes were brown and direct, and she held herself with the careful posture of someone who had learned not to waste energy on fear. Sarah taught at the small schoolhouse on the east side of town and took in sewing on the side. People described her as good, which in Cheyenne meant she wasn't a gossip and she paid her debts. She had been widowed 2 winters before. Her husband lost to pneumonia after a blizzard trapped him on the road from Laramie. That loss had hardened her in certain ways and softened her in others. She spoke gently, but she didn't flinch from hard facts. She approached on foot, her skirt hem held up slightly to keep it from dragging in mud and frost. She stopped at the edge of Silas's porch and waited until he noticed her. "Mr. Boone," she said, voice clear in the wind. Silas straightened, surprised enough to show it. "Miss Larkin." "I heard you were building something unusual," she said, and there was no judgment in the word, only interest. Silas glanced past her toward the road as if expecting a crowd. "They've been saying that." Sarah stepped closer, peering through the open doorway. "Is it a stove?" "Sort of," Silas answered. She looked at him, and for a moment her expression was almost amused, like someone watching a man wrestle a mule and deciding whether to laugh or offer help. "People are calling it foolish," she said. Silas shrugged. "People call most things foolish until they've seen the end of them." Sarah's eyes returned to the brickwork, tracing the line of it as if she could read a story in the shape. "Where will you sleep?" she asked. Silas hesitated, then nodded toward the wide rectangle he was building. "On that," he said. Her eyebrows rose, but she didn't recoil. "And it won't burn?" "If it works the way I think it will," Silas said, choosing his words like nails. "It won't burn. It'll hold." Horace folded her hands, thinking. "You must be very sure." Silas looked down at his mortar-streaked fingers. "Sure isn't the word," he said. "I'm tired of waking up cold." That was the first true thing he'd said out loud to anyone in a while, and he seemed to realize it as soon as it left his mouth. Sarah heard it too. Her face softened, and she nodded as though she understood more than he'd explained. "Well," she said, "if you're wrong, you'll have a story. And if you're right," she paused, letting the thought finish itself. "If you're right, you'll have something better than a story." Silas met her eyes. "That's the hope." She didn't stay long. She didn't ask him where the idea came from. She didn't try to claim it was improper or un-American or any of the other names people liked to use when they were afraid of being surprised. Before leaving, she simply said, "If you need an extra pair of hands mixing clay, I have strong arms for a schoolteacher." Silas let out a small laugh, brief, startled, genuine. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. When she walked back toward town, her boots leaving neat prints in the frost, Silas returned to his work with a different kind of quiet in his shoulders. Not less burdened exactly, but steadier, as if the wind had shifted and given him a moment's mercy. By evening, the sky turned iron dark and the temperature dropped fast. Coyotes yipped somewhere beyond the creek, their voices thin and hungry. Silas lit the lantern and kept laying brick, building a low wall that curved and disappeared into the structure like the beginning of a hidden corridor. He set a salvaged iron door into one end, small, square, blackened from past use, and tested its hinge with a satisfied nod. Outside, men in Cheyenne were stacking wood higher, shouting over wind, making the usual preparations. Inside his cabin, Silas Boone was doing something different, something that looked, to any eye trained by tradition, like an argument against common sense. And common sense, in a place like this, was treated like scripture. Late that night, when the lamp flame trembled and the wind pressed its cold face against the logs, Silas stood back and studied what he had made so far. Stone beneath, brick above, a strange, deliberate shape rising from the dirt floor like a promise that refused to speak its name. The chimney opening he planned was not above the firebox, where it belonged, but far away, where it would force heat to travel, linger, and surrender itself slowly instead of fleeing straight into the sky. He could already hear the laughter that would gather at Hank's saloon. He could already imagine Gideon's sharp advice turning into sharp ridicule when the first smoke curled wrong. He could already see the way a town's opinion could harden like ice and break a man's reputation in a single snap. Silas touched the edge of the brick platform. Cool now, dead and innocent, then pulled his hand away and looked out through the doorway into the dark. The wind howled across the open ground as if it were warning him, or daring him. He closed the door, latched it, and returned to his work. Winter was coming fast, and in Cheyenne a man did not get a second chance to be warm. By the first week of November, the wind changed its tone. It no longer wandered through Cheyenne as it had in autumn, curious and sharp-edged. Now it pressed with intent, a steady northern weight that flattened smoke against rooftops and drove cold into bone and timber alike. The town responded the only way it knew how, by doing what it had always done. Men stacked more wood, women patched coats and hung heavier blankets. Chimneys began to work in earnest, coughing soot and sparks into the gray sky as if to prove they were ready for the trial ahead. Silas Boone worked while they watched. The platform inside his cabin had grown into something unmistakable now, not a pile of stone, not a half-finished hearth, but a deliberate structure. The brick channels beneath it were hidden from view, sealed under a smooth layer of clay and sand, but their presence could be felt in the way Silas moved around the space. He stepped carefully, measuring distances, tapping walls with his knuckles though listening for answers only he expected to hear. He had built the firebox small, no larger than necessary, with iron set tight into the masonry. It offended local sensibilities. A man was meant to build big when it came to fire. Big fires meant safety. Big fires meant pride. Small fires meant fear. Silas had heard that lesson often enough to know it was wrong. On the second morning after the platform's surface was sealed, he hitched Mercy to the sled again and rode into town for supplies. The gelding moved stiffly at first, joints protesting the cold, but once warmed he settled into a steady pull. Mercy was nearing 16, old for a working horse, his coat sun-bleached and his left ear nicked from a long-ago fight with barbed wire. He had belonged to 3 men before Silas, and all 3 had ridden him hard and spoken to him little. Silas did neither. He spoke to the horse as if conversation mattered, and Mercy responded with a patience that felt earned rather than trained. At Talbot's general store, the bell over the door rang sharp and metallic, cutting through the hum of voices and the smell of coffee, kerosene, and wool. Several men stood near the counter, boots planted wide, talking over one another about cattle prices and rumors of snow deeper south. The conversation faltered when Silas stepped inside. He was not disliked. That would have been easier. He was something worse, observed. Behind the counter stood Walter Talbot, the store's owner, a thin man in his late 50s with a long, angular face and hair gone white not from age but from worry. Talbot had come west with ambition and stayed with caution. He wore wire spectacles low on his nose and kept his sleeves rolled, as if perpetually prepared to work or fight depending on which the day required. He knew everyone's business, not because he sought it out, but because people paid him to listen while they bought nails and flour. Talbot glanced at Silas's list and raised an eyebrow. "More clay?" he asked. "You planning to start a pottery?" Silas shook his head. "Finishing touches." Talbot leaned closer, lowering his voice. "They're talking," he said, not unkindly. Silas met his eyes. "They always are." Talbot hesitated, then nodded. "Fair enough." He gathered the supplies, pausing only once more. "Just be careful. Winter don't forgive experiments." Silas took the parcel. "Neither does winter forgive waste." That answer earned him a long look, but no reply. Outside, Hank Whitmore stood near the hitching rail, one boot up on the boardwalk, lighting a cigar. He blew smoke sideways into the wind and watched Silas with open curiosity, the kind that carried no concern for courtesy. "Still at it," Hank said. "Heard Edgar Mills put money on how long it takes before you smoke yourself out." Silas tied Mercy's reins without turning. "Edgar likes to bet," Hank laughed. "He likes to win," he studied. Silas's face. You sure you don't want to come by the Star tonight? Might be your last warm drink before the snow buries you. Silas finally looked at him. I'll pass. Hank shrugged, good-natured in his certainty. Suit yourself. As Silas rode back toward Crow Creek, clouds thickened low and fast, their undersides dark and swollen. Snow came by mid-afternoon, not heavy but persistent, the kind that soaked through wool and found every gap in clothing. Silas worked through it, sealing the last seams, testing the iron door, adjusting the draw of the chimney with careful increments. He lit small fires, not to heat but to observe. He watched how smoke behaved, how it hesitated, slowed, and finally surrendered its warmth before exiting the far flue. It was not perfect. He adjusted again and again. That night, he slept without lighting a fire at all, wrapped in blankets atop the cold platform, listening to the wind scrape at the walls like fingernails. Sleep came. Late, in the early hours before dawn, a knock startled him awake. Silas reached for his rifle before his mind caught up with his body. The knock came again, measured, cautious. Mr. Boone? A voice called. Female, familiar. Silas pulled on his boots and opened the door. Sarah Larkin stood on the porch, bundled in a heavy coat too large for her, her bonnet dusted white with snow. Her cheeks were red from cold, but her eyes were steady. I'm sorry to come so early, she said. But the schoolhouse stove cracked last night. Smoke filled the room. The children were sent home. Silas nodded, already reaching for his coat. I'll take a look. The schoolhouse was a low, drafty building with warped floors and windows that rattled in their frames. Inside, the stove sat cold and fractured, a jagged split running down its iron belly. Silas crouched, inspecting it by lantern light. It'll need replacing, he said. Patch won't hold. Sarah exhaled slowly. We don't have the money for a new one, not before winter sets in. Silas stood, considering. You could use my place during the day, he said. She blinked. Your cabin? For lessons, he clarified. It's small, but it's solid. Sarah hesitated. People will talk. Silas shrugged. They already are. That afternoon, children gathered in Silas's cabin, sitting on benches and crates, their breath puffing white in the air. Sarah taught while Silas worked quietly in the corner, adjusting stone, sealing cracks. The children watched him with fascination, whispering about the warm floor he was building. One brave boy pressed his palm against the brick and giggled when Silas warned him it would be hot soon, though it was not yet. By evening, snow lay thick on the ground. Silas lit the firebox properly for the first time, not as a test, but as a commitment. 3 logs, no more. The fire burned down to coals, and Silas closed the iron door. Hours passed. The platform warmed, not fiercely, not dangerously, but steadily. Sarah noticed first. She paused mid-sentence, placed her hand flat against the brick, and smiled. It's warm, she said, wonder softening her voice. Silas nodded. It holds. The children clustered closer, boots tucked beneath them, laughter filling the room in a way it hadn't all winter. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, warmth remained. That night, after the children had gone and Sarah had thanked him quietly, Silas lay down on the platform and stared at the ceiling. The fire had long since died, but the heat stayed with him, deep and patient. For the first time, doubt loosened its grip. Winter had made its first move, and Silas Boone had not lost. The first true cold settled into Cheyenne the way a debt settles into a man's bones, quietly, without announcement, and impossible to ignore once it arrived. By mid-November, the creek edges were locked in ice thick enough to hold a boot, and the wind no longer teased. It leaned, it pressed, it searched every joint and seam with a patient cruelty learned far north. Smoke from chimneys flattened against rooftops and drifted low, staining the air with the smell of pine pitch and coal dust. Nights came early now, and when they did, they brought a darkness that felt heavier than it had any right to be. Silas Boone woke before dawn and did not feel cold. That alone gave him pause. He lay still on the brick platform, eyes open, listening to the cabin breathe, the faint tick of contracting wood, the whisper of wind along the logs. The firebox had been dark since midnight. He swung his legs over the edge and set his bare feet on the surface. The brick was warm, not hot, a steady, honest, warmth that did not flare or fade. He pressed his palm flat and held it there, counting slow. 10, 20, 30. The heat remained. Silas exhaled, long and measured, as if he had been holding that breath for weeks. He dressed and stepped outside. Frost glittered on the ground like broken glass. Mercy stood with his head low, breath steaming, ears flicking as Silas approached. The gelding accepted a rub along the neck with quiet appreciation. "Still holding," Silas murmured, though whether he meant the horse or the cabin behind him was unclear. Word of the warm floor traveled faster than Silas expected. It moved not by boasting, but by proof. Children talked, children always did. By the second day of lessons held in his cabin, parents had begun to linger at pickup, stamping their feet and glancing down at the brick with expressions that hovered between disbelief and hunger. One of them was Thomas Hale, Margaret Hale's younger brother, newly arrived from Nebraska. He was 36, broad-shouldered, with a heavy beard shot through with premature gray and hands that looked permanently swollen from cold. Thomas had lost 3 fingers on his left hand to frostbite during a blizzard years earlier, a fact he did not volunteer, but which explained his careful way of moving, his dislike of unnecessary risk. He had come west to help his sister after her husband's death, bringing with him a practical mind sharpened by hardship. He bent, pressed his knuckles to the brick, and frowned. "This ain't right," he said, not accusing, merely stating a problem. "Fire's dead," Silas nodded. "Been dead since last night." Thomas tried again, this time with his palm. He straightened slowly. "You running coals under here?" "No." "Steam?" "No." Thomas looked around the cabin as if expecting wires or trickery. "Then, where's it coming from?" Silas tapped the platform lightly with his boot. "From staying." Thomas grunted. "Heat don't stay." Silas met his eyes. "It does if you don't rush it out." That answer stayed with Thomas long after he left. Not everyone was curious. Some were offended. Edgar Mills came by 3 days later, his coat pulled tight, his beard rimmed with ice. Edgar was 50 if he was a day, his hair iron gray and his eyes sharp as a nailhead. He had built chimneys for half the town and wore that fact like a badge earned in battle. Failure to Edgar was a personal insult. He stepped inside Silas's cabin uninvited and stood rigid, arms crossed, studying the walls, the firebox, the far chimney. "You're bleeding heat," Edgar said at last. "Every man can see that." Silas leaned against the wall, "And yet it's warm." "For now," Edgar snapped. "Brick cracks, mortar fails, smoke backs up. You'll choke in your sleep." Silas didn't bristle. "You want to stay tonight?" Edgar blinked. "What?" "Stay," Silas repeated. "See for tonight yourself." For a moment, Edgar looked tempted. Then pride won. "I don't need to," he said. "I know." He left with his certainty intact, but his footsteps were slower than when he'd arrived. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the plains and the cold sharpened again, a new presence appeared at Silas's door, a dog. Medium-sized, black with a white blaze on his chest, ribs showing through a winter coat grown patchy and dull. One ear stood straight, the other bent at the tip, giving him a perpetually questioning look. He was young, perhaps 2 years old, and moved with the wary confidence of an animal that had learned to survive by keeping options open. Silas crouched and held out a hand. The dog sniffed, tail low but wagging. Silas noticed the scars along the flank, old and poorly healed. "You're a traveler," he said softly. The dog followed him inside without being invited and lay down near the platform. Within minutes he had inched closer, then closer. Still, until his belly pressed against the warm brick. He sighed, a sound halfway between relief and surrender, and did not move again. Silas smiled despite himself. "Guess you found your measure," he said. He named the dog Ash for the gray dust that clung to his paws and the quiet way he seemed to rise from nowhere. That night, snow came hard. The wind howled like a living thing, and drifts climbed the sides of the cabin. Inside, Silas fed the firebox once, early, then let it die. Ash slept stretched along the platform, twitching occasionally, as if dreaming of warmer days. Silas slept better than he had in years. The next morning brought trouble. Garrett Moore, no relation to Silas, though the similarity of names often confused outsiders, arrived at the cabin before sunrise. He was a cattle hand from the South Flats, 40 years old, lean as a fence post, with a face permanently drawn tight against wind. His beard was sparse and uneven, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He smelled of smoke and desperation. "My stove's gone," Garrett said without preamble. "Cracked clean through, wood's damp. I can't keep the place above freezing." Silas let him in. Garrett stood stiffly, then stopped, staring at the floor. "Damn," he whispered. "It's warm." Silas nodded. "Sit." Garrett hesitated only a second before lowering himself onto the edge of the platform. His shoulders sagged as the heat worked into him. "I thought you were crazy," he said hoarsely. "Still might be. But this works." Silas poured coffee. They drank in silence while Ash lifted his head and regarded Garrett with cautious interest. "I don't have brick," Garrett said finally. "Or money for it." Silas considered. "You've got stone." "I've got stone." "And hands," Garrett nodded slowly. "I've got hands." They spent the day hauling rock. By dusk, Garrett's cabin had a foundation laid for something new, not a copy of Silas's platform, but a smaller bench along one wall, a compromise born of necessity. It would not hold as much heat. It would not last as long. But it would help. As they worked, Garrett talked, not complaining, just emptying himself of words he'd held too long, about nights waking every hour, about fingers that no longer bent right, about fear of running out of wood before January. Silas listened. He had learned that listening was often the most useful tool a man could offer. By the end of the week, others came, not in groups, one at a time, quiet, curious. They stood in Silas's cabin and pressed their hands to the brick, their faces changing in the same slow way, skepticism giving way to calculation. Hank Whitmore came last. He did not laugh this time. He removed his hat, revealing hair gone thin at the crown, and stood awkwardly near the door. "I hear you're keeping folks warm," he said. Silas gestured to the platform. "It's doing what it's built. Tudu." Hank cleared his throat. "If a man wanted one, built proper, what would that cost?" Silas studied him. "Brick," he said. "Time. Patience." Hank nodded, absorbing the unfamiliar terms. "I've got brick." Silas met his eyes. "Then you've got to start." That night, as Silas lay awake, the wind battering the walls, Ash curled at his feet, he realized something had shifted. Not the weather, not the season, but the way people looked at the cold, not as something to fight louder and harder, but as something to outlast. The heat beneath him was steady, measured, earned. Winter had made its second move, and Silas Boone was learning how to answer. December arrived without ceremony, slipping into Cheyenne like a knife pressed gently at first, then harder once it knew where to cut. Snow no longer fell in polite measures. It came sideways, driven by a wind that stripped heat from skin in minutes and turned breath into something visible and fragile. The plains vanished beneath white drifts that erased roads, fences, and the shallow confidence men carried when autumn still lingered in memory. This was the winter people spoke of later with narrowed eyes and careful pauses, the kind that decided which habits were worth keeping and which would quietly kill you. Silas Boone felt the change before he saw it. Mercy refused his oats one morning, nostrils flaring, head lifted toward the north as if listening to something distant and immense. Ash paced the cabin, nails clicking softly on brick, unsettled in a way he had not been before. Animals knew, they always did. By the second week of December, the temperature fell so sharply that even the bravest chimneys struggled. Fires roared all night across Cheyenne, turning wood into ash at an alarming pace. Men woke hourly to feed flames that never seemed satisfied. Women boiled water indoors just to keep pipes from freezing. The sound of splitting wood became constant, echoing through the dark like a warning bell rung too late. And then one night, the cold proved itself. The wind rose after sundown, howling across the plains with such force that it shook shutters loose and drove snow through any crack foolish enough to exist. Somewhere near midnight, a sharp sound carried through town, the unmistakable crack of timber surrendering. Roofs groaned, ice snapped trees like rifle shots. The creek froze solid from bank to bank. In Silas's cabin, the firebox had gone dark hours earlier. He sat at the small table, oil lamp turned low, repairing a glove with deliberate stitches. Ash slept stretched along the platform, paws twitching occasionally, his ribs rising and falling, in slow contentment. Mercy stood in the lean-to outside, blanketed and calm. The brick beneath Silas's boots held its warmth with stubborn resolve. A knock came at the door, hard, urgent, wrong for the hour. Silas was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, lantern raised. He opened the door to a blast of snow and wind, and a man swaying on the threshold. It was Gideon Rusk. The range foreman looked nothing like the man who had lectured Silas weeks earlier. His coat hung open, buttons torn loose, beard rimed with ice so thick it looked white. His sharp nose was red and raw, and his eyes, usually calculating and cold, were wide with something close to panic. One glove was missing, the exposed hand was purple, fingers stiff and clawed. "My stove collapsed," Gideon said, words slurred by cold. "Flue fell in, smoke everywhere. He staggered, and Silas caught him before he hit the floor. Silas shut the door against the storm and half-carried Gideon inside. Ash lifted, his head, ears back, but didn't growl. He understood urgency when he saw it. Silas stripped Gideon's coat and boots, working quickly, methodically. He guided the man onto the edge of the platform, pressing his stiff hands against the warm brick. Gideon gasped, a sound torn loose from his chest, equal parts pain and relief. "Easy," Silas said. "Don't rush it." Gideon shook violently, teeth chattering. "I told you it wouldn't work," he muttered, not meeting Silas's eyes. "I told everyone." Silas poured hot coffee, held the cup until Gideon's fingers could close around it. "You were wrong," he said quietly. "So was I, about other things. Sit." The warmth worked slowly, deliberately, seeping into Gideon's hands, his feet, his pride. Ash crept closer and laid his head against Gideon's knee, the dog's heat adding to the brick's steady comfort. Gideon didn't push him away. By dawn, the storm had eased but not broken. Snow lay ensculpted, drifts as high as a man's waist. Cheyenne was silent in the way only extreme cold could make it. No wagons, no voices, just the distant creak of buildings under weight. Gideon slept sitting up, wrapped in blankets, breath finally even. When he woke, his eyes were clearer. He stared down at his hands, flexing fingers that now moved, slowly but surely. "You saved me," he said, voice flat with the truth of it. Silas shook his head. "The brick did." Gideon swallowed. "I built things my whole life," he said. "Thought I knew how heat behaved. Turns out I only knew how it escaped." He left later that morning, walking carefully but upright, carrying nothing but his hat and a new silence. News of that night spread faster than any rumor before it. By afternoon, Silas's cabin saw more visitors than it ever had. Not gawkers, survivors, men with smoke-stung eyes, women clutching children bundled too tight. One family arrived with their elderly father on a sled, his breath shallow, lips blue. Silas and Sarah worked together without words, clearing space, laying blankets, guiding frozen hands to the platform. Sarah's auburn hair had slipped loose from its pins, her cheeks flushed with effort, but her movements were calm, precise. She had learned after her husband's death how to function when fear wanted to take over. Among those who came was Reverend Josiah Bell, the town's preacher, a tall, stooped man of 60 with a face carved by years of squinting into wind and scripture. His beard was long and white, his eyes kind but tired. He had once preached that hardship was God's test of character, but that afternoon he said nothing at all. He sat with the children, letting them lean against him, his hand resting flat on the warm brick as if feeling for a pulse. Hank Whitmore arrived just before dusk. He was sober, which in itself marked the seriousness of the moment. His face was pale beneath its usual red, his mustache stiff with frost. He removed his hat and stood near the door, watching Silas work with quiet attention. "I lost 2 barrels of whiskey last night," Hank said finally. "Froze clean through, cracked the staves." Silas glanced at him. "I'm sorry." Hank waved it off. "Money." He looked down at the platform, at the people gathered there. "This, though, this is something else." He cleared his throat. "I want one. Proper. Bigger than this. I'll pay." Silas considered him, then nodded once. "After this storm breaks." Hank nodded back. "After." That night, No one slept alone in Cheyenne. Those with failing stoves crowded into the few cabins that held heat well, Silas's foremost among them. Fires were lit sparingly, carefully. The brick did most of the work. Children slept piled together like kittens. Ash moved from person to person, offering quiet reassurance with his presence. Mercy stood steady in the shelter, unfazed, as if this had always been the plan. Midnight. As the wind eased at last, Sarah sat beside Silas on the edge of the platform. The room was quiet, save for breathing and the faint crack of settling wood. "You were right," she said softly. Silas shook his head. "I was desperate." She smiled, small and genuine. "Sometimes that's the same thing." Outside, the storm retreated, leaving behind a town altered not by disaster, but by survival shared. Winter had made its harshest move yet, and Cheyenne, against expectation, had endured. The storm loosened its grip on Cheyenne, but it did not leave. It lingered in the way men walked more carefully afterward, in the way doors were closed a little tighter, and in the quiet arithmetic everyone now carried in their heads: how much wood remained, how many weeks of cold still waited ahead. Snowbanks hardened into walls along the streets, their surfaces polished by wind until they shone blue in the morning light. The town emerged from that night altered, as places often are after discovering what nearly took them. Silas Boone did not wake to applause or praise. He woke to work. The cabin that had sheltered half the town now bore the marks of it: scuffed floors, damp blankets hanging from pegs, the lingering smell of wet wool and fear slowly giving way to coffee and bread. Ash followed Silas everywhere, his black coat finally beginning to fill out now that regular meals had replaced scavenging. The dog's white blaze stood out sharply against the dim interior, and his once wary eyes had softened into something like trust. He was no longer young enough to be reckless, nor old enough to be slow, an age, Silas thought, where an animal learned the value of staying close. By mid-morning, the visitors began to arrive again, but this time they came with purpose. Hank Whitmore was first, true to his word. He arrived on foot, boots crunching snow, carrying a folded paper and a carpenter's pencil tucked behind his ear. His usual swagger had been tempered, though not erased. He still filled the doorway when he entered, broad and loud by nature, but there was restraint in the way he looked at the brick platform now, as if aware it demanded respect. "I brought numbers," Hank said, holding up the paper, "and brick. Paid Talbot already." Silas took the paper, scanning the rough sketch Hank had attempted. "This'll need adjusting," he said. "You're trying to heat too much air." Hank frowned. "Air's what folks breathe," Silas nodded. "And floors are what keep them alive." Hank grunted, then surprised himself by laughing. "All right," he said. "Teach me." Others followed. Garrett Moore returned, his cheeks healthier, his hands moving with more confidence than they had weeks before. Thomas Hale arrived with stone loaded onto a borrowed wagon, his breath fogging the air as he spoke carefully about his sister's house and the children's rooms. Even Gideon Russ came back, not to argue, but to watch. He stood silent near the wall, arms loose at his sides, studying each measurement with a craftsman's hunger he had not felt in years. A new face appeared that afternoon, one Silas did not recognize. He was a young man, perhaps 22, with a narrow build and restless eyes that darted constantly, as if afraid of missing something important. His hair was light brown and perpetually unkempt, his jaw soft but determined, his hands scarred despite his youth. He wore a wool coat too big for him, and boots, mended more than once. He introduced himself as Elias Turner, recently arrived from Iowa, apprenticed briefly to a mason before the man drank himself out of business. "I heard you were building something different," Elias said, voice quick, eager. "I want to learn." Silas studied him for a moment. "You ever worked stone in winter?" Elias nodded. "Once. Lost feeling in 2 fingers for a month." He smiled thinly. "Didn't stop me liking it." Silas handed him a trowel. "Then you can mix." The work that followed was not fast, it was careful. Silas insisted on testing each channel, each seam. He rejected shortcuts even when materials ran thin. Some men bristled at that. Others understood after watching how the brick responded, how heat moved when allowed to linger rather than escape. Sarah Larkin came when she could, bringing food, keeping notes, organizing schedules with a precision born of teaching restless children. She watched Silas work with a thoughtful eye, noting how he explained not just what to do, but why. The town noticed too. Silas Boone, once regarded as quiet to the point of oddness, had become a man people listened to, not because he spoke louder, but because he spoke last. By the end of the week, the first new platform outside Silas's cabin was finished. It belonged to Margaret Hale. Margaret was a small woman with dark hair pulled tight at the nape of her neck, her face pale but composed. Widowhood had carved lines into her expression that age alone would not have claimed so soon. She watched silently as Silas lit the firebox for the first time, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles whitened. The fire burned down. The hours passed. Margaret knelt and pressed her hand to the bench they had built along the wall. Tears welled unannounced, sliding down her cheeks without sound. "My children won't wait cold," she said. Silas stepped back, letting that moment belong to her. Not all reactions were gentle. 2 days later, Caleb Norton arrived. Caleb was a representative of the Territorial Insurance Cooperative, a man whose livelihood depended on assessing risk and assigning blame before disaster struck. He was in his early 40s, tall and thin, with a sharp chin and a neatly trimmed mustache waxed into points. His coat was fine, his boots unscuffed, his gloves spotless. He looked at Cheyenne as if it were a problem to be solved rather than a place to live. "I've received reports," Caleb said, standing stiffly in Silas's cabin, "of unconventional heating methods, brick beds, horizontal flues." Silas leaned against the wall. "They work." Caleb sniffed. "That isn't the question. The question is liability." He circled the platform, tapping the brick with his cane. Fire risk, structural failure, carbon monoxide. Silas met his gaze evenly. "Stay the night." Caleb recoiled slightly. "That won't be necessary." "It will," Silas said, "if you're going to write about it." Silence stretched. Outside, the wind moaned low. Ash lifted his head, watching Caleb with quiet suspicion. Finally, Caleb nodded stiffly. "Very well." That night, Caleb slept on the edge of the platform, rigid at first, then slowly loosening as the heat did its work. He woke before dawn, face flushed, eyes thoughtful. He examined the firebox, the chimney, the draft. He asked questions, not accusations this time, but precise technical ones. Silas answered each carefully, without embellishment. By midday, Caleb wrote his report. "It will require oversight," he said, handing Silas a copy. "Standards, thickness requirements, minimum distances." Silas scanned the page. "You're not banning it." Caleb hesitated. "No," he said. "I'm recommending it." The news traveled quickly. By Christmas week, the sound of stone being set echoed across Cheyenne. Brick was scarce now. Men traded favors, labor, anything to secure enough. Not every build was perfect. Some failed and had to be redone. Silas corrected what he could, taught Elias Turner until the young man's hands steadied and his confidence found discipline. Elias proved a quick study. He listened more than he spoke, learned the language of heat as if it were a dialect he had been waiting to hear. One evening, as they cleaned tools by lantern light, Elias said quietly, "My father froze one winter, wouldn't leave the fire, wouldn't sleep away from it." Silas nodded, understanding without prying. The town changed its habits. Fires burned smaller, wood piles shrank more slowly, nights grew quieter. On Christmas Eve, Reverend Bell held service not in the church, whose stove had failed again, but in Silas's cabin. Candles flickered, voices rose, soft and unsure at first, then stronger. The brick held their warmth, steady as a promise kept. Sarah sat beside Silas, ash curled between them, mercy visible through the window, steam rising from his breath. When the singing ended, Sarah leaned close and whispered, "You didn't just change how we heat our homes." Silas looked around the room, at faces relaxed, hands uncracked, eyes no longer hollow with fear. "No," he said, "the cold did." Outside, snow fell gently, no longer an enemy, just a fact of the season. Winter had not ended, but it had been answered. January came with no softness left in it. The calendar promised a new year, but the land did not acknowledge such paper comforts. Cheyenne lay pinned beneath ice and sky, the snow no longer white but hardened and gray, marked by tracks, ash, and the slow grind of daily survival. What warmth the town now possessed had been earned, measured carefully in brick, stone, and restraint. Silas Boone had never worked harder. Each morning began before light. He rose from the warm platform, careful not to wake Ash, who had grown heavier and sleeker, his black coat glossy now with health. The dog was nearly 3 by Silas's reckoning, his once lean frame filling out into quiet strength. Ash had developed the habit of placing himself between Silas and the door whenever strangers arrived, not aggressive, but watchful, his bent ear twitching at unfamiliar voices. Mercy, too, bore the winter with stoic patience. The old gelding's breath smoked heavily in the mornings, and Silas rubbed his legs longer now, feeling the stiffness beneath skin and hair. Mercy had begun to favor his right foreleg, an old injury stirred awake by cold. Silas noticed everything. He always had. The demand for heated platforms spread beyond what Silas could manage alone. Elias Turner worked beside him daily, his youthful restlessness tempered by discipline. The young man's hands had grown surer, his shoulders broader from labor, his confidence quieter. He spoke less now, listened more, and when he did speak, it was with the careful precision of someone who understood the weight of getting things wrong. But not everyone came with honest intent. Late one afternoon, as Silas and Elias finished sealing mortar at the O'Hara residence, a modest cabin near the rail spur, a man waited by the fence line, watching them. He was well dressed for the season, coat tailored, scarf neatly knotted, gloves of fine leather. His beard was trimmed close, his mustache narrow and sharp. He leaned on a polished cane, posture relaxed in a way that suggested control rather than ease. He introduced himself as Leonard Pike. "I represent Eastern interests," Pike said, smiling thinly. "Investors, manufacturers." His eyes moved constantly. Over the brickwork, the firebox, the chimney's distant rise, he saw not warmth, but opportunity. "You've done something remarkable here, Mr. Boone," Pike continued. "You've created demand." Silas wiped his hands on his trousers. "I didn't create winter." Pike chuckled politely. "No, but you've made it profitable." He spoke of factories back east, of stamped components, of prefabricated systems that could be shipped by rail and installed quickly. He spoke of patents and ownership, of licensing designs that would bear someone else's name. All the while, his smile never reached his eyes. "I'd like to offer you a partnership," Pike said. "A generous one." Silas felt something tighten in his chest. Not temptation, but recognition. He had seen men like Pike before along the railroad lines, men who arrived after the work was done and claimed they'd always been part of it. "This isn't a product," Silas said evenly. "It's a practice." Pike's smile thinned further. "Everything is a product eventually." Silas shook his head. "Then you're talking to the wrong man." Pike studied him for a long moment, then straightened. "Think carefully," he said. "Others won't be so principled." When he left, his boots left no marks in the snow. Elias watched him go, jaw tight. "That man will come back," Elias said. Silas nodded. "Or someone like him will." The refusal had consequences. Within days, brick prices rose. Talbot apologized, genuinely distressed, explaining that suppliers had received large orders from outside buyers. Rumors followed, of systems being built poorly in neighboring towns, of fires caused by shortcuts, of a family in Laramie's, sickened by smoke from a badly copied design. Silas knew what that meant. When something spread faster than understanding, mistakes followed. He called a meeting. It took place in the schoolhouse, its stove still unreliable, but supplemented now by a temporary brick bench Silas had helped install. Men and women packed the room, coats on, breath visible. Sarah stood at the front with Silas, her presence steadying, familiar. Silas spoke plainly. He did not sell, he explained. He spoke of thermal mass, of patience, of the danger of rushing heat. He warned against copying blindly, against shrinking channels or cheap mortar. He answered questions until his voice grew hoarse. Gideon Rusk stood near the back, arms crossed, listening harder than anyone. When Silas finished, Gideon stepped forward. "I've built chimneys wrong for 30 years, Gideon said, voice carrying. "I won't build these wrong too." That declaration mattered more than any endorsement. Afterward, Gideon stayed late, working through drawings with Silas and Elias. The old mason's hands were scarred, his fingers thick and stiff, but his understanding was deep. Pride had once narrowed him, survival had widened him again. Outside of town, the cold claimed its toll regardless. A rider was found frozen near the North Flats, young, inexperienced, caught between shelter and pride. His death weighed heavily on Silas, not because it was preventable by brick, but because it reminded him of the limits of what warmth could fix. He attended the burial with Sarah and Reverend Bell, standing in silence as wind scoured the hilltop. Sarah's hand brushed his sleeve once, briefly. No words passed between them. That night, Silas returned home late, exhaustion settling into him like another layer of cold. Ash rose to greet him, tail thumping softly. Mercy shifted in his stall, nickering low. Silas sat on the platform and let the warmth work its way through him. He thought of Pike and his polished cane, of the rumors spreading beyond Cheyenne, of the line between sharing knowledge and losing control of it. Sarah arrived quietly, a basket on her arm. "I brought stew," she said. "And news." Silas looked up. "Good or bad?" "Both," she said, setting the basket down. "The council wants to formalize what you're doing. Guidelines, oversight." Silas considered that. "And the bad?" Sarah met his eyes. "They want you involved, officially." Silas exhaled slowly. He had never wanted authority. Authority came with expectations, and expectations came with compromises. "And if I refuse?" he asked. "They'll do it without you," Sarah said gently. Silas leaned back, staring at the ceiling, feeling the steady heat beneath him. Outside, the wind howled, not as fiercely as before, but with persistence. "All right," he said at last. "Then I stay." Sarah smiled, relief softening her features. Winter pressed on. The cold did not lessen. But Cheyenne now faced it with structure, knowledge, and something like unity. Silas Boone had wanted only to sleep warm. Instead, he had inherited responsibility, and that, he knew, would cost more than brick ever could. February did not arrive gently. It came the way endurance always did, without drama, without mercy, and without apology. The days grew longer by minutes that few noticed, and the nights remained brutal, the cold settling into Cheyenne with the stubbornness of something that had no intention of leaving just because the calendar suggested it should. Snow no longer fell often, but when it did, it came heavy and wet, packing itself into every rut and hollow before freezing solid again by nightfall. The town creaked under its own weight, wood groaning, stone tightening, iron snapping sharp in the mornings. Silas Boone felt older, not in his bones, those had been tested long before this winter, but in the way decisions followed him home and refused to stay outside. The council's request had become a reality faster than he liked. There were meetings now, held in the drafty back room of Talbot's store, where men argued over measurements and liability and who would be allowed to build. What? Silas sat through them with patience earned the hard way, answering questions, correcting assumptions, reminding them again and again that shortcuts were not efficiency and speed was not skill. Gideon Rusk stood beside him at most of these gatherings, arms folded, gray beard trimmed shorter than it had been in years. The old mason had changed in small but unmistakable ways. He listened before speaking now. When he did speak, men quieted. Gideon had lived too long, built too much, and nearly frozen to death to waste breath on pride anymore. Elias Turner took notes, his pencil scratching constantly. The young man's face had grown leaner, more serious. His eyes no longer darted, they focused. When he spoke, it was usually to clarify, not to impress. Silas watched him with a mixture of concern and approval. Knowledge once given had a way of changing people whether you meant it to or not. Outside of meetings, the work continued. Silas spent his days moving between cabins, checking builds, adjusting flues, reinforcing mortar where the freeze-thaw cycle threatened to undo careful work. Ash followed him faithfully, his gait confident now, his coat thick against the cold. The dog had claimed the town as his territory, trotting between houses with the quiet authority of something that belonged. Children greeted him by name. He accepted their hands solemnly, as if recognizing their gratitude for warmth he himself had sought without understanding it. Mercy's condition worried Silas more with each passing week. The old gelding's limp had worsened, his right foreleg stiff even after long rub-downs. Silas shortened their rides, choosing to walk more often, a decision Mercy accepted without complaint. Age, Silas knew, was not a failure. It was simply a debt paid slowly. One afternoon, a stranger arrived on horseback from the south. He was a tall man, lean and dark-haired, with a hawk-like nose and a trimmed black beard that showed careful maintenance even in winter. His coat was worn but well kept, his saddle old but meticulously cared for. He rode with the posture of someone accustomed to distance and solitude. When he dismounted near Silas's cabin, Ash approached him cautiously, tail low but wagging. The man introduced himself as Daniel Crowell. "I'm a surveyor," he said, voice measured, carrying the faint accent of the East. "Been traveling between towns. I've seen what's happening here." Silas studied him. "Seen what?" "People surviving," Crowell replied. "Better than elsewhere." Crowell explained that neighboring settlements, smaller, less organized, had suffered badly during January's cold. Poor copies of the heated platforms had failed. Fires had broken out. In one place, a hastily built system had collapsed through a floor, injuring a child. Crowell spoke without embellishment, but the facts landed heavily. "They're blaming the idea," Crowell said, "not the execution." Silas felt the familiar tightening in his chest. "Ideas don't build themselves." Crowell nodded. "No, people do, and people talk. I'm here to ask if you'd consider traveling, teaching." Silas looked out toward the plains, where the horizon blurred into ice and sky. "I can't leave," he said. "Not now." Crowell accepted that without argument. "Then you'll need something else," he said. "A way to make sure what you started doesn't turn dangerous once it leaves your hands." That night, Silas lay awake long after the firebox had gone dark, staring at the ceiling, Ash's warm weight against his legs. He thought of Leonard Pike's polished shoes leaving no tracks, of poorly built systems collapsing under snow, of the thin line between sharing knowledge and unleashing it. By morning, he had an answer. The plan took shape slowly, deliberately, like heat moving through brick. Silas gathered Gideon, Elias, Sarah, and Reverend Bell at his cabin. He spoke plainly, outlining a system of apprenticeships, of written guidelines copied by hand, of builders approved not by title or money, but by demonstrated understanding. Gideon would oversee masonry standards. Elias would train new hands. Sarah would organize schedules and records, her neat handwriting lending order to what might otherwise become chaos. Reverend Bell would lend his name and moral weight, ensuring the effort remained communal rather than commercial. They called it nothing official. No banner, no charter, just a practice. Resistance came quickly. Leonard Pike returned before the week was out, his smile unchanged, his patience thinner. He mocked the idea of handwritten standards, called it quaint, inefficient. "You're standing in the way of progress," Pike said. Silas met his gaze evenly. "No," he replied. "I'm standing in the way of profit without responsibility." Pike's eyes hardened. "That won't stop others." Silas nodded. "No. But it will slow them." The confrontation ended without resolution, but the lines were drawn. As February wore on, something unexpected happened. The town began to rest. Fires burned lower. Woodpiles, though diminished, did not vanish. Nights grew quieter. People slept longer. Illness lessened. The doctor, an older man named Dr. Samuel Hodge, short and stooped with hands always smelling faintly of spirits, remarked offhandedly that he had fewer cases of frost-related sickness than in any winter he could remember. He did not attribute it to brick or design, only to warmth held and shared. One evening, as Silas checked a newly finished platform on the edge of town, he found Mercy struggling to rise in the stall. The horse's breath came fast, shallow. Silas knelt beside him, hands firm but gentle, speaking softly. Mercy's eye rolled toward him, calm despite the pain. There was nothing to be done. Silas stayed with him through the night, the cold held at bay by the brick bench they had installed nearby. When Mercy finally went still, it was without panic, his body warm, his work finished. Silas buried him the next day on a rise overlooking the creek. Ash sat beside him, head lowered, unmoving. Loss did not stop winter. It never did, but it sharpened what mattered. By the last week of February, the snow began to soften during the day. Icicles dripped, mud returned. The town moved cautiously, not trusting the change. Daniel Crowell returned once more, passing through on his way north. He stopped long enough to tell Silas that word of Cheyenne's winter had traveled farther than anyone expected. "People are asking how," Crowell said, "not just what." Silas nodded. "That's the right question." As March approached, the cold loosened its grip, not gone, but weakened. Cheyenne stood altered, not by invention alone, but by restraint, by the choice to let heat linger, to let knowledge travel slowly enough to be understood. On the final night of February, Silas sat on his platform, Ash asleep at his feet, Sarah beside him. Outside, water dripped steadily from the eaves, a sound as unfamiliar as it was welcome. "You never wanted this," Sarah said quietly. Silas shook his head. "No." She smiled, resting her hand briefly against the warm brick. "But you held it anyway." Silas looked around his cabin, at the walls that had sheltered more than he ever intended, at the heat that remained long after the fire was gone. Winter had taken much, but it had not taken what endured. March arrived the way forgiveness often did, reluctant, uneven, and impossible to mistake once it truly began. The snow did not vanish all at once. It softened first, sagging under its own weight, then retreated in patches, revealing earth dark and swollen with melt. Cheyenne smelled different now, not clean, not yet, but alive. Mud replaced ice. Water ran in the ditches again. The creek broke its hard shell with a sound like distant applause, and for the first time in months, the wind carried something other than threat. Silas Boone felt the change beneath his feet before he trusted it with his eyes. The brick platform still held warmth each morning, though the nights no longer demanded it with the same cruelty. He rose later now, Ash stretching beside him, the dog's black coat shedding its winter thickness in soft clumps that clung to blankets and trousers alike. Ash was fully grown, solid and sure, his bent ear still giving him that permanently curious look. He had taken to waiting at the door each dawn, not to guard against danger, but to check whether the world outside had softened enough to greet. Silas opened the door and breathed deep. The air was cold, yes, but it no longer cut. The town moved cautiously into spring. Wagons returned to the streets. Fences were righted, roofs repaired. Wood piles, though diminished, had not vanished, and that fact alone changed how men spoke of the past winter. It was no longer a story of survival scraped thin, but of endurance managed wisely. Silas's days grew quieter. Not empty, never that, but less urgent. The platforms were built now. The worst dangers passed. Gideon Rusk oversaw repairs where needed, his old hand steady, his instructions concise. Elias Turner had taken on 2 apprentices of his own, boys barely out of their teens, their faces eager and unscarred by winter's worst. Silas watched them work from a distance, correcting only when necessary. Knowledge had found its way into other hands. That was how it was meant to be. One morning, Reverend Bell arrived at Silas's cabin with a folded notice. "They want to mark it," the preacher said, beard now trimmed short against the warming days, eyes thoughtful. "Not a monument. Just a record." Silas frowned. "Mark what?" "This," Bell said, gesturing around the room. "What happened here? How the town came through." Silas shook his head. "It wasn't me." Bell smiled gently. "No," he agreed. "It never is." The notice went up in the town ledger instead, quiet ink on aging paper, no celebration, no speeches, just a line noting that the winter of that year had seen fewer deaths, fewer illnesses, less desperation than any in recent memory. The reason was not named, only implied. That suited Silas. Sarah Larkin came by that afternoon carrying a bundle of books tied with twine. Her auburn hair was looser now, freed from winter's constant bundling, catching light when she moved. She looked rested in a way Silas had not seen before. The hard edge of vigilance softened at last. "The schoolhouse stove's been replaced," she said. "Properly this time." Silas nodded. "Good." She hesitated, then smiled. "They asked me to stay on year-round." "That wasn't guaranteed?" he asked. She shook her head. "Nothing ever is." She set the books down. I said yes. They sat together on the edge of the platform, the brick still warm enough to notice, though barely. Outside, Ash chased melting snow in clumsy bursts, skidding and recovering with offended dignity. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "Starting all this?" Silas considered. "No," he said. "I regret not doing it sooner, and I regret thinking it would stop at me." She studied him. "You didn't choose what it became." "No," he agreed, "but I chose not to turn away." That evening, a stranger arrived. He was older than most who had come through that winter. His hair iron gray, and his beard worn long, braided once at the end in a style Silas did not recognize. His face was lined deep, not by age alone, but by years spent watching weather rather than calendars. He introduced himself as Wei Lin. "I work with the rail crews," Wei Lin said, his English careful but strong. "I heard about the warm floors." Silas nodded, offering him a seat. Ash approached, sniffed, then settled at Wei Lin's feet without ceremony. Wei Lin smiled faintly. "Animals know," he said. He spoke of northern provinces, of stone beds heated by winding channels, of old methods passed down without names attached. He listened as Silas described his own design, asked questions not to challenge but to understand how the idea had changed in crossing an ocean and a culture. "You did not copy," Wei Lin said finally. "You remembered." Silas felt something settle in him at those words. "I didn't know enough to do more." Wei Lin stood to leave, adjusting his coat. That is often why things survive. When he was gone, Silas remained seated for a long while, Ash's warmth against his leg, the platform's heat fading slowly, deliberately, as it always did. Spring advanced. By April, grass pushed through the mud, the creek ran full and loud, children played outside again, their laughter sharp and unguarded. Elias Turner announced he would be heading north in the fall, invited to help a settlement build properly from the start. Gideon Rusk agreed to go with him, for a season at least, to make sure they don't do anything foolish. Silas helped them pack, offering tools, advice, silence when needed. The cabin grew quieter. One night, near the end of April, Silas banked the fire for the last time that season. The platform warmed, then slowly cooled, releasing its stored comfort into the room one final night before surrendering to spring. He lay awake beside Sarah, Ash curled at their feet, listening to rain tap, gently against the roof. "I think it's done," Silas said softly. Sarah turned to him. "What is?" "The winter," he said. "And what it asked of me." She smiled. "It asked more than you expected." He nodded. "And left less than I feared." Morning came bright and wet. The platform was cool beneath Silas's feet, the warmth fully spent, given back to the air at last. He stood for a moment, hand resting on the brick, feeling not heat, but memory. Outside, Cheyenne went on. Years later, travelers would pass through and notice odd things: chimneys placed too far from fires, floors that stayed warm long after stoves went dark, cabins that seemed to hold comfort like a secret. Some would ask, some would not. The answers, when given, were always plain. A man had watched heat long enough to learn how it wanted to stay. That was all. Silas Boone never claimed invention. He never sold a design. He lived his life quietly, sharing what needed sharing, keeping what needed keeping. Ash aged beside him, gray creeping into his muzzle, still choosing the warmest spot in any room. Sarah remained, teaching, laughing more easily now. The town remembered the winter not for its cruelty, but for what endured beyond it. When the ground finally forgot the cold, the brick remembered. And that was enough. Sometimes, the miracles God sends into our lives don't arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through patient hands, humble hearts, and choices made when no one is watching. A man refusing to give up, a home that stays warm, a child who sleeps through the night, an animal that finds safety at last. This story reminds us that God often works through ordinary people who choose kindness, wisdom, and courage over fear. The warmth that saved this town was not just brick and stone. It was faith put into action. It was love made practical. And that same quiet miracle still exists today in our homes, our communities, and the small decisions we make every day to care for one another. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope right now. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read every one. And if you believe that compassion still matters, that no child or animal should ever face fear alone, please subscribe to this channel so these stories can keep reaching those who need them. May God bless you, keep you warm in both body and spirit, and remind you that even in the coldest seasons of life, His quiet miracles are never far away.